Now we move to the presentation part, and we have the first paper, which is Kashmir Before the Common Era in Brill's Encyclopedia of Hinduism and Wikipedia, a critical analysis in 2022. It's being presented by my very well-learned colleague, Megh Kalyanasundaram. He's the Director Special Projects of Indica. Just we could go on and on introducing him, but here's a quick profile of Megh. Megh Kalyanasundaram is an Indian citizen with close to 9 years of lived experience in China, an alumnus of ISP, and he's currently the Director Special Projects at Indica. His postgraduate specialization is in strategy, leadership, and marketing, and it's included a study of research methods. His professional experience includes stints as a market leader at a global Fortune 50 firm, as head of business development at a leading Indian talent development multinational, and he has served a term on the board of a Shanghai-based not-for-profit. His academic research interests and 20-plus papers span some aspects of ancient Indian chronology, Indian knowledge systems, landscape in Indian texts, ancient Indian jurisprudence, ideas of India, and philosophy. For his creative contribution to the first edition of the International Day of Yoga, he was invited by the Permanent Mission of India in the UN to attend the inaugural event. Other professional and pro bono pursuits have included building differentiated digital platforms for Indic text targeted at specific learning and research needs, and music. His research-based compositional Sanskrit album Bharat and Her Kashmira has been listed by the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, while his subsequent album has recently been accepted for listing by the Vedic Heritage Portal. In 2022, Megh was invited by the National Museum Institute to contribute content for multiple projects currently underway at NMI, including ones on Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh and Kedarnath. I invite Megh to present his paper, Kashmir Before the Common Era in Brill's Encyclopedia of Hinduism and Wikipedia, a critical analysis in 2022. Over to you, Megh.
Namaste. Om Saraswati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambham Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sada Shruti Smriti Purananam Alayam Karunalayam Namami Bhagavat Padam Shankaram Loka Shankaram Purana Nyaya Mimamsa Dharma Shastranga Mishritaha Vedaha Sthanani Vidyana Dharmasya Cha Chaturdasha Kashmirair Mahite Chaturdashatayim Vidyam Kashmirair Mahite Chaturdashatayim Vidyam Vidadbir Mahakavye Tadbhuvi Naishadhiya Charita Ayurvedo Dhanurvedo Gandharvashchaiva te trayaha Arthashastram Chaturthantu Vidyaha Ashtadashaivata. At the outset, I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to this conference taking shape. As I start this, it's 10:24, and I'll try to stick to the time that I've been given. 3 quick points. I'll be reading my paper, portions of it, and therefore it is scripted, so I request your indulgence. Second, if any portion of this presentation is posted anywhere in social media or shared anywhere, I request that it be done along with the link to this paper, which will be up on Indica's platform and on my academia profile as well. With that, the abstract of my paper reads, is Patanjali Mahabhashya the earliest Indian source to attest to the word Kashmir? Does Kashmir in the Mahabhashya occur in a context that only reveals information about rice cultivation in the valley? Is Kashmir not mentioned anywhere in the Vedic literature? Did Panini call the people of Kashmir Kashmirikas? If one were to look for answers to these questions in the Brill's Encyclopedia of Hinduism, which claims in its preface that the depth and breadth of information provided in it are unmatched by any reference work on Hinduism, and Wikipedia, one will find statements that answer the above questions in the near affirmative. This paper will foreground evidence from Ashtadasha Vidya texts, lack of evidence in one case, and secondary literature that problematizes answers to the above questions in the near affirmative. Finally, this paper will add a new data point to the considerations already present in a recently published paper, Landscape in the Natya Shastra, and close to its spatial origin, a study in 2019, that strengthens the case for Kashmir when thinking about the spatial origins of the Natya Shastra. What you see below is the structure of my presentation. It is in 6 parts, starting with my gratitude, And my gratitude is to the author of this book, the book that educated me substantively about Kashmir's history and has since been a consistent source of inspiration for whatever little I've done, songs, papers, and more vis-a-vis Kashmir. It's titled The Making of Early Kashmir, Landscape and Identity in the Rajatarangini by historian scholar Dr. Shunalika Kaur. On right are some of the articles in the public domain, which are accessible. Silence on Kashmir's historical identity, naysayers versus history, Kashmir always a part of the idea of India. More importantly, the book also deals, as you can see in the bottom, about what is history, how does a land become a homeland, how a cultural identity is formed, explores its understanding of regional selfhood, and traces Kashmir's connected histories with the rest of India. This book came out in 2018, and it has been a huge source of inspiration for me. Moving on to previously, here is a snapshot of the papers that I have written. You don't need to read each one of these. On the right side bottom is my academia page detail, and you'll be able to access all of these over there. Related to Kashmir, here's some of the work that I've done. In 2018, like I said, I read the epochal book published by Dr. Kaur. Subsequently, I read Stein's translation of Kalhana's Rajatarangini, and a journey began of trying to understand Kashmir as a student. In 2019, I wrote a paper which basically was a survey of Kashmir in the Ashtadasha Vidya Itihasa Mahabharata, and then jointly authored a paper along with Padmaja Venkatesh Sureshji, which was presented in a conference in 2020 organized by IGNCA in Himachal Pradesh. It was a national seminar. In 2020, I composed and launched a Sanskrit album by the name Bharata and her Kashmira. Dr. Kak was very kind enough to kind of put out his view on the paper Landscape in the Natya Shastra, LITN. In 2021, this album was listed by IGNCA. I was accepted for listing by IGNCA, and subsequently it has been listed now. It was featured in ISB's LitFest, amongst other places. I was terribly excited, actually, to be able to contribute whatever little I could as part of a content creation seminar organized by the National Museum Institute earlier this year for a museum focused on Jammu and Kashmir. And earlier this year, a Sanskrit song with a Sukta to Surya, along with lines from the Mahabharata, actually played in the Sun Temple, Anantnag. So this is a snapshot of some of my work related to Kashmir. Now moving to the paper proper, the first part. So look at the excerpt one. It's called, I'll just read that out. Panini called the people of Kashmir Kashmirikas. Now this excerpt one is a statement in a Wikipedia entry titled Kashmir, and it claims that Panini called the people of Kashmir Kashmirikas. Now, of the three endnotes, 10, 11, 12, attached to the statement in Wikipedia, the one numbered 10 leads to a page 64 of the book India and Central Asia, Classical to Contemporary Periods, where Kashmirikas is mentioned. Now, the paper contains all the details of which book, who's the author, etc. The problem, though, is that neither Kashmirika nor Kashmirika, insofar as I've seen at least, is attested as is in any of the works attributed by most people to Panini, namely the Ashtadhyayi, Sutra Patha, Dhatu Patha, Gana Patha, Unadi Patha, Paniniya Shiksha, and Paniniya Linganushasanam. What one can find, though, are 4 instances of Kashmir in the Gana Patha, which are listed on the right. Now, even if one were to accommodate without agreeing with the view that the Ganapatha was not Paninian, but pre-Paninian, and there are at least 2 scholars who have taken that view, Pawate in 1934 and Ayachit in 1959. I'm not saying I agree with them, but even if one were to accommodate that view, that would only make the instances of Kashmir in the Ganapatha older than the time Ashtadhyayi was composed and older than the time of Panini. So while Kashmirikas is something that I have not been able to find, Kashmir is attested in the Ganapatha. In 2.1, that is the previous section, we have seen, amongst other things, how Kashmir is at least as old as the time of Panini. I will now analyze Alexis Sanderson's view in excerpt 2. If, as we just saw in 2.1, Kashmir is at least as old as Panini, how can Sanderson claim that Kashmir is not mentioned anywhere in the Vedic literature and it appears in no Indian source before the Mahabhashya? Where does he say it? He says it in this excerpt on the left. I read, quote, Kashmir is mentioned nowhere in Vedic literature and it appears in no Indian source before Patanjali's Mahabhashya of circa 150 BCE, where it occurs in the context that reveals only that rice was being cultivated in the valley at that time. You can find this in the Brill's Encyclopedia of Hinduism, Volume 1, page 103. Now, let me take the second of the 2 points mentioned at the top first. There could be a few possibilities over here. Sanderson thinks that the Mahabhashya was composed before the Ganapatha, which would be plain wrong. Second, he does not know of Kashmira in the Ganapatha, which, while possible, and if so, might require him, therefore, to reconsider or revise his view. Neither of 1 or 2. If 3, which is neither of 1 or 2, is he making this claim based on the territory implied in his usage of the word Indian? In other words, is Sanderson saying that Kashmira appears in no Indian source before the Mahabhashya because he thinks that the Ganapatha was composed in a place outside the territory of the Indian nation after 1947 CE? If this is his reason, and if he knows of Kashmira in the Ganapatha, then he should, in my view, at least have mentioned both. That is, his reason and his knowledge of Kashmir in the Ganapatha, and added where he thinks the Ganapatha was composed. To know about Kashmira in the Ganapatha and still not mention it when making statements about its absence before the Mahabhashya, at the very least, in my view, is misleading. Now to the first point. What is at least as problematic, if not more, especially when writing for an article in an encyclopedia of Hinduism, is to put the Mahabhashya itself, and by omission the Ganapatha too, outside the ambit of Vedic literature. Such a view is in direct conflict with an emic history of Hinduism, the ism part of which is deeply problematic given its colonial roots, in which Vyakarana is seen as an anga of Veda, of one of the 6 Vedangas, as part of at least 2 Indic systems of knowledge, Vidyasthanams, Ashtadasha Vidya and Chaturdasha Vidya. Engaging with Sanderson's view is significant, in my view, at least for one more reason. Consider how historian Mridu Roy has cited Sanderson in the section titled First Peoples and the Ownership of Kashmir in her recent article, Narratives from Exile, Kashmiri Pandits and Their Construction of the Past, in the book Kashmir and the Future of South Asia, published in 2021. Given that Rai has not bothered to write, at least not before the epochal book, The Making of Early Kashmir by Dr. Shanalika Kaul in 2018, about the pre-Islamic history of Kashmir, even as she theorized about some facets of Kashmir's history and her future, it is unsurprising that Dr. Mridu Rai's recent treatment is thin. In a section titled as sweepingly as First Peoples and the Ownership of Kashmir, she essentially merely cites Sanderson's comparison of the origin myth, I'll come to that, of Kashmir, as found in the Moola Sarvasti Vada Vinaya, 1st or 2nd century, according to Dr. Rai, and the Nilamata Purana, to allege a so-called Brahminical appropriation of a supposedly Buddhist myth. Unlike Sanderson, Dr. Rai's article has no place even for Patanjali's Mahabhashya, leave alone Panini and the Ganapatha, both of which belong to a time before the time Moola Sarvasti Vada Vinaya was composed, supposed to have been composed, namely 1st and 2nd century CE. What else can it be, if not her privilege, that Dr. Rai can hurl insufficiently substantiated charges, such as privileged, thin, ahistorical, and more, when her own engagement with the pre-Islamic history of Kashmir, which is at least twice the duration of Islam's history in Kashmir, is as thin as it is. I return to Sanderson's view to the third part of excerpt 2. According to him, Kashmir occurs in the Mahabhashya in a quote, context that reveals only that rice was already being cultivated in the valley at that time. My concern is with his usage of the word only. Let me explain. Let us first see the instances of Kashmir in the Mahabhashya. I could find the following, and I'm not taking you through each one of these. Now, thankfully, Sukumar Sen has published in 1955 a translation of some of these verses, and specifically of verses of Devadatta in the Mahabhashya. Now, from the last two translations in the image above, which might be difficult for you to read, but it's there in the paper, don't worry, which allude to Kashmir, it should be clear that they reveal more than only the fact that rice was being cultivated in Kashmir at that time. Both of them allude first to Devadatta. They tell us that someone was asking Devadatta if he remembered their journey to Kashmir, where they lived, ate rice dishes, and drank gruel of parched grain. What else does the Mahabhashya tell us about Devadatta himself? It reveals that Devadatta's family had come from Shrugna. He belongs to the clan of Garga. He lived in Pataliputra. He recited Vedas, and that at least one host might have considered him to be a Brahman. All of these are from the image that you see below. Even if the story of Devadatta in the Mahabhashya is only a myth, let's just say, I don't know if it is a myth or not, but let's say it is a myth. We have here the story of a person who apparently lived in Pataliputra, who apparently could recite the Vedas, and who had at some point in time visited Kashmir. This story is attested in the Mahabhashya that Sanderson pegs at circa 150 BCE, which is at least 1.5 centuries before the Mula Sarvasti Vada Vinaya was composed, which Mridurai has pegged to 1st or 2nd century CE. While the Devadatta story, even if a myth, is not a myth about the origin of Kashmir, like the Mula Sarvasti Vada Vinaya or the Nilamata Purana are, it is nevertheless a story in a non-Buddhist text of the Vedic tradition, dated to a period before the earliest mention of Kashmir in a Buddhist text, and which tells us a story of a Veda chanting person's travel to Kashmir. That is certainly more than, at least in my view, only information about rice having been cultivated in the valley, in contradistinction to what Dr. Sanderson has posited. Is that all one can glean about the relationship between Kashmir and Patanjali? To conclude so would be, in my view at least, to miss almost completely the key conclusions of 164 pages of writing across 3 articles titled Patanjali's Mahabhashya as a Key to Happy Kashmir, Gonardya, Gonikaputra, Patanjali and Gonandya, Patanjali, a Kashmirian, written by scholar Ashok Aklujkar and published first in 2008 as part of the book Linguistic Traditions of Kashmir. Dr. Aklujkar's multidisciplinary examination of the possibility of Patanjali being a Kashmirian is an effort whose depth and breadth of information appears, at least to me, unmatched to date. The absence of this topic and Dr. Aklujkar's analysis is glaringly conspicuous in an entry on Kashmir in an Encyclopedia of Hinduism, which is touted as an encyclopedia whose depth and breadth of information are unmatched by any reference work on Hinduism. So what I've done in this section, as you might have observed, is to engage with the mainstream, engage with a portion of an article focused on Kashmir in a very influential article, part of a very influential encyclopedia called the Brill's Encyclopedia of Hinduism. And I've also engaged with this later publication in 2021, Kashmir and the Future of South Asia. The latter, particularly, I think, needs more attention, perhaps, from Kashmiri Pandits, because there's a lot going on about them in this particular book, especially in the article by Dr. Rai. I'm mindful of the time, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into this aspect of my paper in too much depth. So I will move on to the conclusion. This paper contributes, insofar as I have seen, uniquely to the literature on Kashmir by presenting an original critical analysis of some facets of the early history of Kashmir found in articles titled Kashmir in an influential academic source, the Brill's Encyclopedia of Hinduism, and a pervasive popular source, Wikipedia. In the paper's analysis section, I have shown why answers in the near affirmative to the questions in the abstract, namely, is Patanjali's Mahabhashya the earliest Indian source to attest to the word Kashmir? Does Kashmir in the Mahabhashya occur in a context that only reveals information about rice cultivation in the valley? Is Kashmir not mentioned anywhere in the Vedic literature? Did Panini call the people of Kashmir Kashmirikas? Is, in my view, that is, the answers to all these questions in near affirmative, is, in my view, problematic. In response to excerpt 1, I have shown in section 2.1, Kashmir in Panini, that while there is a Paninian or pre-Paninian textual evidence of Kashmir, courtesy of the Ganapatha, I don't see any textual evidence in works attributed to Panini which supports the view that Panini called the people of Kashmir Kashmirikas. In response to excerpt 2, statements of Alexei Sanderson, I have posited in section 2.2, Kashmir and Patanjali, that it is misleading to not mention the Paninian or pre-Paninian textual evidence of Kashmir, courtesy of the Ganapatha, while discussing the earliest Indian source that attests to the word Kashmir, and declaring Patanjali's Mahabhashya as the earliest Indian source to attest to the word Kashmir. Subsequently, I have invoked an emic history to contest the view that Kashmir is not mentioned anywhere in Vedic literature, given its presence in both the Ganapatha and the Mahabhashya. Thereafter, using some facets of the story of Devadatta in the Mahabhashya, I have shown how Dr. Sanderson's view that Kashmir in the Mahabhashya occurs in a context that reveals only that rice was being cultivated in the valley at that time is incorrect, and posited that the evidence related to Devadatta in the pre-Mula Sarvasti Vada Vinaya and Mahabhashya is crucial when discussing the earliest myths, if Devadatta's story is a myth, that is, in texts related to the early history of Kashmir. In the same section, I have engaged with Dr. Rai's article, First Peoples and the Ownership of Kashmir, and shown why I think her contributions to the discussion on the textual evidence vis-a-vis early Kashmir is thin, for reasons including but not limited to omissions of sources of evidence, not just the Ganapatha, but also the Mahabhashya and much more of the subsequent texts. Finally, in section 2.3, which I didn't cover in the section, in the context of the arguments related to the spatial origins of the Natya Shastra in a recent paper, I have foregrounded evidence from Apte's dictionary and more to make the point that Manomohan's Ghosh is at least not alone when he's translated Priyangu as saffron, and to that extent that this counts, it strengthens the case of Kashmir as a candidate for the spatial origins of the Natya Shastra. These are the references used in my paper. The time now is 10:44. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meghji. Do we have any questions from the audience? There is a comment though from Arvindji. There was an inquiry from the delegates, the attendees, that if there would be a Q&A. So I should have mentioned it earlier. The structure is a 20 plus 5 minutes kind of a thing for every presentation, which includes 20 for presentation and 5 minutes for Q&A. We made sure that we had lesser presenters so that there could be a good amount of time spent on Q&A. So are there any questions for Meghji? I actually second what Arvind ji has said in the comments. Neat tracing of key terms, cutting through the clutter as always. I just wanted to share one thing, that while reading your paper, I came across this Mridula Rai paper, and you might be aware that I've just started my coursework for PhD, and it is in a field wherein this particular reference was of great use, because while reading that, it led me to another, and so I have personally gained from your paper in ways more than one. So thank you so much for that.